Hey everybody, thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we're going to be taking a look at the discography of the Los Angeles-based rock band Failure. In my opinion, Failure is one of the most underrated groups to come out of the 90s. They had a sound that was very dynamic, and because of that, they're a tough group to categorize into one genre, but throughout their discography, they have delivered some top quality music that has flavors of so many different worlds, such as alternative metal, grunge, space rock, art rock, and shoegaze. And Ken Andrews and Greg Edwards are two people that I would regard as very unique and very underrated songwriters and lyricists who contributed some pivotal stuff to 90s rock music. And I think this is a band that way more people need to be exposed to because they truly deserve way more recognition for their amazing contributions to rock and metal. And similar to a lot of different groups that came out of the 90s, Failure would take a long hiatus and then eventually reunite in 2014, and they've continued to perform and make music since that time. So it's a great time to be a fan, but it's also a great time to be discovering this group. So I'm very happy to be covering them for today's episode. And what I'm going to do is go through their 6 studio albums, starting with Comfort and going up to Wild Type Droid. And I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest. And I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 6 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. All right, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1992 titled Comfort, and I will give this a B. I think this is a pretty good first record, definitely not their best album, and I do think there are much better records that follow it. But regardless of that, there are certainly a lot of great things on this record. Stylistically, this album draws on a lot of different sounds. Primarily, I would say it's in some sort of alternative metal umbrella with flavors of grunge, punk, and noise rock. On production, we have Steve Albini, so it definitely has that raw sort of production style. And I've always been sort of hit or miss with Steve Albini. There are certain albums that I really enjoy his production on, and others that don't resonate with me as much, and this would be one of those records for me. I don't think the production on here is anywhere near as good as it would be on the following albums when they took over the production themselves. But regardless of that, this album still has plenty of great songs with all of the unique qualities that make up that Failure sound, with tons of very cool and unorthodox guitar parts, with interesting harmonic movements, and lots of dissonant and tense chord voicings on tracks like Swallow, Kindred, Salt Wound, and on the intro of Something. And that style of guitar writing is something that I've always been particularly fascinated with. When it comes to Failure and their sound, they're definitely not afraid to take twists and turns into more unorthodox territories with their chords. And I would say I think they have some of the most unique guitar writing of any rock band to come out of the 90s. I think these kinds of guitar parts make the music much more interesting, and it just gives you a lot more unique and bizarre sounds that you can sink your teeth into. As far as the songwriting goes, I do think the majority of the tracks on here are very good, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that this record is filled with the best and most exceptional songs of Failure's discography. I don't know if any of the tracks on here would make my top 10 Failure song list, but that's not to say that these are bad songs. I just think their songwriting would get even better on future records. And even though I think the majority of this record is good, it still has a couple of songs that I would say are okay but aren't amazing, with tracks like Screen Man, Kindred, and Pro Catastrophe. My favorite track on here would be the opener, Submission. I think that's the perfect track to kickstart this album and introduce you to the very unique sound that is Failure, with those dissonant guitar riffs and just the overall really bleak mood of the track. And for a couple of other favorites, I would go with Macaque, Swallow, and Salt Wound, which is a hauntingly awesome track to conclude this very intense album on. So all in all, I do think this is a very cool album. It has a lot of really unique sounds to it and tracks that will sound unlike any other metal or rock album to come out of 1992. It does have a handful of songs that I think are very good and showcase all of the unorthodox sensibilities that are part of the Failure sound. But like I said, I think the production is not the greatest. It gets much better from the next album and onward, and I think their songwriting gets even better on future records. Once they get a little bit more time to develop their sound and they start writing together, I think even more magic starts to happen from that point on. But regardless, this is still a very cool album, so I will give this a B. Okay, next we have their second studio album from 1994 titled Magnified, and I will give this an A. I know some people might be surprised that I'm not putting this in S tier, but I do think they have even better albums that will follow it. But this is certainly a very solid record and definitely an upgrade from Comfort. The sound and style are getting much more clearly defined as Ken and Greg had started writing together during the sessions for this record, and they also took over on production, which was a significant improvement. Stylistically, this one ventures off into some different territories, and it isn't as metal-centric as the first record was, with this one bringing more of a hybrid of alt-rock, alt-metal, grunge, punk, and some elements of space rock. In terms of the sound, it's much more crisp and fine-tuned, whereas the production style of Steve Albini on the previous record gave us much more of a raw sort of sound. So the cleaner production and the more cohesive and well-defined stylistic directions that they were writing in does feel like a big improvement from where they left off on with Comfort. This album only features a live drummer on 4 of the tracks, with the remainder of the songs being programmed drums, and the album is 10 tracks long, opening up with the incredible track Let It Drip, a super hard-hitting song that's very bass-driven and has a really badass sort of edge to it. And I do think the bass takes on a more prevalent role on this record, and we start hearing some of those classic, energetic, and distorted bass grooves that are another staple of the Failure sound, and one of the big reasons why they can get such a massive sound for only being a trio. For the remainder of the album, we get a mixture of different styles and elements from track to track, with some amazing experimental alt-rock and alt-metal tracks like Moth, Frogs, Bernie, Wet Gravity, and Magnified, which also has some punk elements on certain sections. We also get an amazing track titled Undone, which is actually my #1 favorite Failure song. I love everything about this track: the colorful chord progression, the beautiful vocal melody, the shoegazy sorts of textures that are created throughout the vocals and instruments. In my opinion, it is just the perfect melodic rock song. In addition to Undone, my other favorite would be the closing track, Small Crimes. I think it's a very awesome closer that gives us some nice space rock flavors and has some of the most badass and heavy bass parts of any Failure song, and the way it builds and switches the dynamics is so beautiful. The only song that I've never been crazy about on here is Wonderful Life. Not sure why, but that song has just not grown on me no matter how many times I've listened to this record. And other than Undone, I'm not sure if any of these other tracks would actually make my list of top 10 favorite Failure songs. Obviously, these are all great songs, but I do think that I tend to resonate with some songs from other albums a little bit more. So those would be my 2 main reasonings for putting this in A tier rather than S. But regardless of that, I still think this was a solid upgrade from Comfort, and the production and songwriting is definitely more polished and enhanced. And I think this is a very solid alt-rock and alt-metal album to come out of the year 1994. So I will give this one an A. Alright, next we have their third studio album from 1996 titled Fantastic Planet, and obviously I'm going to give this one an S. This is an absolutely spectacular record. I would go as far as to say it's a masterpiece. Not only is this my favorite Failure album, but I also think it's one of the most underrated albums of the entire decade of the 90s. I remember when I first heard this record, I just kept thinking in my head, how have I never heard this record before? I would put this up there with any of the classic albums of the 90s. It really is that good. And it's a longer record at almost 68 minutes in length, and it's 17 tracks long. And for an album of that length, it is really incredible how consistent the entire record is from front to back. I feel like anytime you have an album that's on the longer side, it does increase the likelihood of there being some skip over tracks, but that could not be farther from the case with this album. I think every single song on here is fabulous. Stylistically, we get a great combination of alternative rock, grunge, art rock, and space rock, and almost all of Failure's most well-known tracks are on this record, and we hear one of those tracks right at the opening of the album with Saturday Savior, a perfect song to bring things in. It builds really nicely, and it feels so satisfying when that first chorus comes in with the full band. Such a great way to kickstart this album. Then we have a brilliant follow-up track titled Sergeant Politeness, and this one gives us a really nice burst of energy, and this would easily be one of my favorite tracks from this album and would definitely make my list of top 10 favorite Failure songs. After that, we have the first of 3 shorter segue tracks, all 3 of which are amazing and unique in their own ways and function as very nice transitional tracks. Then we go into Smoking Umbrellas, a very cool song with some dissonance happening between the guitar, bass, and vocal melodies, which creates a very cool and disorienting effect. I love the key change during the chorus too. It takes an unexpected turn into some different harmonic territories that are very colorful. After that, we bring the energy up with the very driving and bass-heavy Pillowhead, another amazing song with a seriously badass and hard-hitting chorus. Then they bring the energy down with a ballad titled Blank, another one with some very beautiful guitar parts. Then that is followed by Segue 2, and then we go into Dirty Blue Balloons, another great alt-rock track that starts out more mellow but builds nicely and goes into a nice hard-hitting chorus, similar to Saturday Savior. After that, we go into a very unique track titled Solaris. So many different things are going on throughout this song with the varying moods and different energies, and at this point we're a little over halfway through the album, and I think it's been perfect so far. The placement of every track has been very effective, great contrasting feels and tempos, and just a very exciting and unpredictable track listing that keeps the listener on the edge of their seat for the entire time. The album then continues with another one of my favorite tracks titled Pitiful. I love everything about this song. The rhythmic groove in the guitar is very cool, the chord voicings create some very cool open sounds, and the chorus is incredibly hard-hitting and has such a cool vibe to it. Then we go into one of the more straight-ahead songs on this album titled Leo, which gives us some more alt-rock and grunge flavors, a really solid track. And then we have Segue 3, which is more acoustic guitar-centered, and that brings us into The Nurse Who Loved Me, which is an awesome track, on the slower side, tempo-wise, with some great contrasting acoustic and electric guitar parts, and again, some very interesting chord movements, in particular the movement between the first and second chord of the main progression, some really fascinating sounds going on in that section. And as you can see, there are just so many interesting little chord movements all throughout this record, and this album would have to have my favorite guitar writing of any Failure record. After that, we have 2 back-to-back classic Failure songs with Another Space Song and Stuck on You. Another Space Song is probably my favorite song from this record. That track creates such a lush and euphoric atmosphere that just washes over you when you're listening to it. I cannot say enough good things about that track. And obviously Stuck on You is a classic and probably the song that most people know Failure for. And I think putting these 2 tracks back to back towards the end of the album was a very effective move. It does a great job of just keeping the energy and the momentum all the way up throughout this entire 17-song track listing. And it sets up the final 2 tracks of the album beautifully, starting with a really badass song titled Heliotropic. I absolutely love the drum and distorted bass groove on this one, and the vocal melody on top of it is very catchy. An awesome song, and it sets up the closer beautifully, which is titled Daylight. And this is a track that's very similar to the opener. It starts out a little more stripped down and then eventually has the full band come in, and we get this very intense and very satisfying conclusion to this absolutely incredible record. And as you can see, I really have nothing negative to say about this album. From front to back, I think it's incredible. For a 17-song album that's over an hour in length, there is not one dull moment. And of every Failure album, this one by far has the largest amount of my favorite songs by them. And like I said, I think this is one of the most underrated albums to come out of the 90s. And if you have not heard this record yet, you owe it to yourself to check it out and see what I'm talking about. In my opinion, this is about as close as you can get to a perfect album, and this would easily go down as my #1 favorite Failure record. So this one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their 4th studio album from 2015 titled The Heart is a Monster, and I will give this an A. I think this is a super solid record. This was their first album in almost 20 years, and a little backstory as to how this came about. So Failure would break up in 1997 and take on their own projects, and as the years would go on, their cult following would continue to grow and strengthen, and their music was reaching a lot of new ears, and the band would eventually reunite in 2014 and do some performances and start working on this record. As far as the sound of this album goes, I would say it's in a general alt-rock sort of umbrella, but still contains those quirky and diverse elements from song to song that make the Failure sound so unique, and I think the songwriting sounds fresh all throughout this and shows that they are still very capable of writing very high-quality songs. It's 18 tracks long, and it opens up with a continuation of the segues that we left off on from Fantastic Planet, opening the record with Segue 4, and we'll actually hear a few more segues on here than we did on Fantastic Planet. This one has 6 segues, and I don't necessarily think every single one of these segues was needed. It can feel like a little much, especially in the later half of the album, and I do think they could have trimmed down the segues a bit, and that is one critique that I will give this album, and one of my reasons for putting it in A tier rather than S. But in the grand scheme of the album, I wouldn't say that the segues are the end of the world. The album still delivers a really diverse palette of sounds with lots of individual standout tracks. For the first half of the record, my favorite song would have to be Counterfeit Sky. That's just a super solid rock track that's very catchy but still musically very interesting. And a couple of other favorites from the first half would be Atom City Queen, Hot Traveler, and Mulholland Drive, which is a very surprising piano-centered track that takes a detour from the types of styles that we normally hear from Failure. I love the contrast that this song provides. It almost gives me a Mr. Bungle sort of vibe. For the second half of the album, my favorite track would be Come Crashing. I really love the tasteful guitar voicings and the beautiful vocal melodies on top of it. A very dreamy and euphoric song. And my other favorites from the second half would have to be Otherwhere and I Can See Houses. And I do think the songs on the second half of the album are the stronger songs from this record, but I do think the segues get a little disruptive, and ultimately it does take away from the second half of the album a little bit for me. But regardless of that, they certainly delivered an amazing comeback album that still contains all of those core elements of the Failure sound, but also sounds refined and very fitting for the year 2015. I wouldn't say the songs on here are as of high quality as the songs on Fantastic Planet, but to be fair, I do think that Fantastic Planet is almost an impossible album to follow, but this is certainly a great return album, and it delivered a really solid batch of new Failure tracks. So a very good album. I will give this an A. Alright, next we have their 5th studio album from 2018 titled In the Future Your Body Will Be the Furthest Thing from Your Mind. And this might surprise some people, but I'm actually going to give this one an S. I absolutely love this record. It would go down as my second favorite Failure album after Fantastic Planet. From the moment I heard this record, I was immediately hooked. Stylistically, it continues on a similar path to what we heard on The Heart is a Monster, but I think everything on this record sounds like an improvement. I think the songwriting is even better. It has more tracks that I find really exceptional, and they continue with the segues, but they only use 3 of them, and I think that also significantly helps with the pacing and the momentum. And similar to the previous record and similar to Fantastic Planet, this one is also on the longer side with 16 tracks, and I really think the momentum on this one is incredibly strong from front to back. A lot of the thoughts that I had about Fantastic Planet also carry over to this record, and when we're talking post-Fantastic Planet albums, this one has the largest amount of my favorite songs by far. It opens up with Dark Speed, which has this awesome bass line with a great drive to it. Instrumentally, this song has always reminded me of Radiohead, and I think this was a very cool track to choose for the opener because it doesn't sound like a typical Failure track that you would expect from them. Then from that point on, it is just one amazing and one unique song after the next. For the first half of the album, my favorite tracks would be Paralytic Flow, What Makes It Easy, and No One Left. No One Left is easily my favorite song from this album. In my opinion, it has one of the most beautiful and intense choruses of any Failure song, and I love those guitar sounds at the very beginning where he's hitting the strings behind the nut of the guitar, giving off some Sonic Youth vibes. To me, this track just contains everything unique and everything beautiful that Failure has to offer in one song. A track that would definitely make my top 10, if not maybe even top 5 Failure song list for sure. For the second half of the album, my favorite tracks would be Found a Way, which has one of the coolest and most colorful arpeggiated guitar riffs of any Failure song. And for other tracks on the second half of the album, I would go with Heavy and Blind, and the closer, the Pineal Electorate, which is another piano-centered track that gives me some Beatles vibes, a beautiful closer, and in my opinion, an even stronger piano track than Mulholland Drive, although that song is certainly amazing as well. And I really like the fact that the second half of the album gives us a lot of these little detours from track to track. Distorted Fields gives us a hard-hitting alt-rock track with that classic distorted bass sound. Heavy and Blind has a dark, almost lo-fi sort of sound and instrumentation to it. Another Posthuman Dream gives us a beautiful ballad. And the closing track, like I had mentioned, gives us that piano feature. So I really love everything they did on here. I do feel like I am in the minority with how much I love this album and how I'm placing it as their second best album. I'm sure there are going to be some people that think that this take is insane and that I should have put Magnified as the number 2. But I am wondering if anybody else loves this record as much as I do, because I really don't know what is not to like about this record. I think every single song on here has something unique and interesting about it, and there's such a great variety of styles and moods, and it just makes for a very fun and very enjoyable 16-track album that contains the majority of my favorite Failure songs to come from that post-Fantastic Planet era. So an incredible record, my second favorite Failure album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, and lastly, we have their sixth and most recent studio album from 2021 titled Wild Type Droid, and I will give this one an A. I think this is a very solid record. I do think the previous album is a little bit better, but I do like this one more than The Heart is a Monster. And for me, this one has kind of always been a tie with Magnified. It's really hard to pick which one I like more. I think it really just depends on what mood I'm in. But I would say those two records are tied as my third favorite Failure album. I think this record is very consistent from front to back, and this was one of those albums where I actually wasn't a huge fan of it when I initially put it on. Not sure why that is, but I didn't find it that intriguing after the first listen, but the more I listened to it, the more and more it grew on me, and it just kept getting better and better the more I listened to it. And for a while, I was actually debating putting this record in S tier, but the more I listened to it and compared it to Fantastic Planet and the album prior to this one, I do think that I like those two albums more enough to warrant putting them in separate tiers, but this was a close call regardless. This one is on the shorter side than the previous two records. This one is only 10 tracks long, and it's around 40 minutes in length. And we get a really nice blend of everything with some solid alt-rock tracks like Water with Hands, Headstand, and Mercury Mouth. We get those classic distorted bass grooves on tracks like Submarines and Bad Translation. We get a couple of songs with some mellow and acoustic elements in certain sections with tracks like Bring Back the Sound, Undecided, which also has some electronic elements to it, and the beautiful acoustic ballad Half Moon, which Greg is doing some beautiful lead vocals on. And this track concludes the album on a very sweet and serene note, and is probably Failure's most stripped down and vulnerable song to date. We also hear some post-rock elements on A Lifetime of Joy, which is a very nice little surprise, and I think they did a great job on this record of delivering those core elements of the Failure sound, but also building upon it and surprising us on certain tracks or certain sections of songs with these different stylistic detours. And the fact that they're able to still do that at this point in their discography is a very good and very promising thing. As far as favorite songs go, for the first half of the album, my two favorites would have to be Headstand and Bring Back the Sound. And for the second half of the album, we have my number one favorite track from this album, which is Long Division. That is just such an amazing and powerful song that takes you on a journey of so many different emotions. That's a track that would easily make my top 10 favorite Failure song list, and I think this track just completely steals the album. So all in all, I think this is an amazing record. It doesn't have any songs that I dislike, and I think this record is a great indicator of the fact that Failure is still on top of their game in terms of their songwriting, and they are continuously surprising us even at this point in their discography. So a very good record. This one gets an A. Alright, so those are my takes on their 6 studio albums. This is a band that I would say does not have a bad album. Each record offers such a unique palette of sounds that I think can appeal to a wide range of different types of music listeners. And like I said at the beginning of this video, I think anybody who is aware of Failure will agree with the fact that they are one of the most underrated rock bands to come out of the 90s, and they really deserve just way more recognition for all of their amazing contributions, and in particular for the album Fantastic Planet, which, like I said, I think is one of the best rock albums to come out of the 90s, and it should be held up there with the likes of Nevermind, Super Unknown, OK Computer, and all of the other household records that everybody knows from the 90s. But I think also because of their more obscure status, it does add this cool element to being a Failure fan where you feel like you've sort of stumbled upon this hidden gem that the world just hasn't discovered yet. And I don't think I've ever felt that as strongly as when I discovered the Fantastic Planet album. And from that point on, I was just hooked, and I needed to explore all of their records and take in everything that this band has created. And I would highly recommend the same for anybody who is unaware of this group, and for anyone who may have heard a song or two but haven't checked out their full albums. Definitely do yourself the favor of listening to this incredible and very underrated band. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was enjoyable. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists, which are linked in the comments and the description, and see if there's anything else that you might like. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 6 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, that is it for today. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Take care.